The firing range at Redstone Training Annex came alive before sunrise, when the dust still clung low to the ground and the air smelled of burnt powder from yesterday's drills. And at the far end of the lanes, an old man worked alone with a push broom, dragging spent casings and shredded target scraps into neat piles like he was tidying up after a storm no one else remembered. He was an elderly American male with a white beard cut close, a deeply weathered face, and a posture that suggested patience rather than weakness, wearing a faded red shirt beneath a reflective vest, blue jeans stiff with old dust, and worn boots whose soles had been replaced more than once. To the young soldiers rotating through live-fire qualification that week, he looked like background scenery, the kind of man you stopped noticing after the first glance. The soldiers arrived loud and confident, rifles slung, helmets clipped, OCP uniforms still stiff from supply, joking as they lined up behind the firing line while instructors checked rosters and ammo counts, and it didn't take long before their attention drifted to the quiet old man sweeping between lanes. "Hey," one private laughed, nudging his buddy, "range fairies already at work." Another smirked, "Man's cleaning targets like they're gonna grow back." Their laughter bounced off the berms, sharp and careless, and the old man heard it all, every word, but didn't slow his rhythm. He pushed the broom forward, gathered brass, tapped the edge against the concrete, and moved on, eyes scanning the lanes with the same quiet focus he'd used every morning for years. As the platoon sergeant called them to attention and began the safety brief, the jokes softened but didn't stop, whispered now, sharper because they thought they were safe. "You think he even knows what those targets are for?" someone muttered. "Probably just told where to sweep." The old man passed behind them, close enough that one soldier deliberately nudged a pile of casings back into the lane with his boot, grinning as if daring a reaction, and the old man bent, collected them again, and said nothing, because he had learned long ago that silence kept you invisible, and invisibility let you see more. The range officer called for eyes and ears, explained the course of fire, the distances, the silhouettes they'd be shooting that morning, all standard, all routine, and the soldiers listened with half their attention, already convinced they'd breeze through. What they didn't notice was the old man pausing near the control shed, glancing at the target rails, the motors, the selector panel behind a locked steel door, listening not to the briefing, but to the cadence of voices and the way confidence was turning into carelessness. One of the soldiers laughed again, louder this time. "Watch," he said, pointing subtly. "Old guy's probably scared of the noise." The old man looked up briefly, not offended, just measuring, and went back to his work, sweeping the last lane clean, checking the berm face, making sure nothing reflected light the wrong way. The range officer finished the brief and called for weapons up. And as the soldiers loaded magazines and checked safeties, the old man set his broom against the wall and wiped his hands on a rag, eyes moving from shooter to shooter, noticing grip tension, finger placement, shoulders too tight, stances built on ego instead of balance. This was where the stakes lived, not in jokes, not in laughter, but in small mistakes multiplied by live rounds, and the old man felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet awareness that today's routine had teeth. A young corporal glanced over and snorted. "What's he looking at?" he whispered. "Like he's grading us." Another soldier chuckled. "Let him watch. Only thing he's ever fired is a broom." The old man didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on the target line downrange, the silhouette set to pop up at fixed distances, predictable angles, easy patterns that rewarded speed more than thought, and he frowned, not in anger but in calculation. The range officer gave the command to prepare, the soldiers raised their rifles, and the air shifted from casual to charged, the way it always did just before rounds went downrange. The old man stepped into the control shed quietly, the steel door closing behind him with a soft click that no one noticed. And inside, surrounded by switches and selectors that governed what the shooters would see, he rested a hand on the panel and took a slow breath. Outside, the soldiers settled into firing positions, still smiling, still mocking under their breath, convinced this was just another qualification run, unaware that the man they'd laughed at had just decided the routine needed to change, because sometimes the safest lesson was the one you didn't warn people about until they were forced to adapt. Keep listening, and which city are you listening from? And if you enjoy the story, please subscribe for more. The first volley cracked across the firing range with sharp, concussive snaps, rifles bucking against shoulders as brass spilled onto the concrete and dust puffed from the berm in rhythmic bursts. And the soldiers grinned behind their optics because the targets behaved exactly as expected. Silhouettes popping up on schedule, clean profiles, generous exposure times. Easy work for men who believed speed was skill. Laughter still leaked through clenched teeth between commands, muted but present, and one private even glanced back toward the range lanes where the old man had been sweeping, rolling his eyes as if to say, "See, nothing special here." Inside the control shed, the old man stood still, listening not to the gunfire, but to the timing, counting shots, watching through the narrow window as shooters rushed follow-ups without resetting their breathing, trusting muscle memory instead of discipline. He watched misses get shrugged off, watched poor fundamentals hidden by forgiving targets, and he felt the quiet certainty grow stronger. They were learning the wrong lesson. Outside, the range officer barked corrections, but his voice competed with ego and noise, and the soldiers adjusted just enough to keep passing, not enough to actually improve. One corporal laughed between strings. "Told you," he muttered to his buddy, "old guy S just here to clean up our mess." Another smirked. "Bet he's never even touched a selector switch." The old man's hand rested on the control panel, fingers hovering over settings most people never changed during basic qualifications: target speed, exposure duration, randomization patterns, tools designed for advanced drills, not routine checks, and he waited because escalation without timing was just chaos. The range officer called a ceasefire to reset lanes, and the soldiers stood, stretching, checking hit patterns, congratulating each other on tight groups that looked impressive only because the test had been easy. A private kicked at spent brass and laughed. "Man, I could do this blindfolded," he said, loud enough for the lanes to hear. Another chimed in, "Maybe we should let the janitor shoot next, give him a confidence boost." Their laughter echoed, and the old man heard it through the concrete walls of the shed, not offended, just confirming what he already knew. Confidence had outpaced competence. When the range officer called them back down, the soldiers dropped into prone again, still relaxed, still casual, and the old man exhaled slowly and flipped the first switch. Downrange, the targets responded, not immediately, not obviously, but just enough to change the rhythm. Silhouettes popped for half a second less, forcing shooters to snap decisions instead of settling comfortably, and a few rounds clipped dirt instead of steel. The laughter died a little. "What was that?" someone muttered. The range officer frowned, scanning the lanes, but said nothing, assuming it was a minor system adjustment. The old man watched carefully as shooters compensated poorly, slapping triggers instead of pressing, rushing sight pictures instead of trusting alignment, and he adjusted again, this time changing the sequence so targets no longer appeared in predictable left-to-right order. Confusion crept in like cold. "Targets are glitching," a soldier whispered. "They're not where they should be." Another hissed back, "Just shoot faster." Shots rang out, less confident now, less clean, and the berm showed more misses than before. The range officer shouted corrections, his tone sharper, but the soldiers were no longer grinning. One private glanced back toward the shed, suspicion flickering. "Is he messing with something?" he asked, half joking, half nervous. The old man made no dramatic move. He simply watched and waited, letting the drill expose what bravado hid. He adjusted again, enabling lateral movement on the silhouettes so they shifted slightly while exposed, forcing shooters to track instead of plant, and the effect was immediate. Rounds scattered, curses slipped out, and a corporal slammed his fist lightly into the ground in frustration. "What the hell?" he muttered. "This wasn't the brief." The range officer turned toward the control shed, irritation rising. "Who's running the panel?" he called. The old man didn't answer yet. He wanted the moment to mature, for realization to replace anger, and outside the soldiers were no longer mocking, they were struggling. One private failed to engage 2 targets in sequence and heard the buzzer tone marking a miss, his jaw tightening in disbelief. Another lifted his head too soon, breaking position, and earned a sharp correction from the range officer. Sweat replaced swagger. The old man watched posture collapse under stress, watched discipline fray when routine disappeared, and he felt a quiet sadness, not because they were failing, but because they had laughed instead of learning when it mattered most. The range officer called ceasefire again, more forcefully now, and stood, scanning the lanes. "Something's different," he said aloud. "This isn't malfunction, this is design." His gaze slid toward the control shed door. Inside, the old man rested his hand flat on the panel and nodded once, as if answering a question no one had asked yet, because the escalation had done its job. The soldiers were no longer laughing, no longer mocking, and the firing range, once predictable and forgiving, had become honest, and honesty, he knew, was the most dangerous thing a careless shooter could face. The range felt different now, not louder but heavier, like the air itself had decided to stop cooperating with confidence. And as the soldiers waited behind the firing line during the forced pause, their earlier jokes echoed back in their own heads with an edge that made them uncomfortable. Helmets were adjusted, gloves tugged tighter, Eyes flicked repeatedly toward the control shed where the old man had disappeared. And for the first time that morning, silence crept in where laughter had lived. The range officer paced slowly, hands on his hips, scanning the lanes and then the target berm, his expression shifting from irritation to curiosity because he knew the system well enough to recognize intent when he saw it. "This isn't a malfunction," he said finally, voice low but carrying. "Someone is running an advanced pattern." The soldiers exchanged looks, confusion mixing with unease, and one corporal muttered, "Why would anyone do that on a basic qual?" Another answered under his breath, "Unless they think we're not ready." The range officer's gaze settled on the control shed door, and he frowned because that shed was supposed to be locked down unless adjustments were authorized. Before he could speak again, a new sound cut through the range, not gunfire, but engines, slow, deliberate vehicles rolling up behind the berm, staff cars with flags mounted on the fenders. Conversations died instantly. Soldiers straightened without being told, instinct overriding confusion, because no one missed the significance of command vehicles showing up unannounced at a live-fire range. Doors opened and a small group stepped out, senior NCOs, a colonel, and at the center, a general officer whose presence compressed the space around him. The range officer snapped to attention, heart skipping, and moved to meet them. "Sir," he reported, crisp and professional, "live-fire qualification in progress." The general nodded once, eyes already moving, not to the shooters, not to the targets, but to the control shed. His steps slowed, then stopped, and he stared at the closed steel door like it had just spoken to him. One of the senior NCOs noticed and leaned in slightly. "Sir," he asked. The general's jaw tightened, a subtle reaction, and he said quietly, "Open that." The range officer hesitated only a fraction of a second before nodding and signaling for the door. When it swung open, the old man stood inside, exactly where he had been, one hand resting lightly on the control panel, posture relaxed, expression unreadable, as if he'd been expecting this moment rather than surprised by it. The general stared at him, eyes narrowing, and then something shifted, recognition blooming into disbelief. "That's not possible," the general murmured, almost to himself. The old man looked up, met his gaze, and gave a small nod, not deferential, not proud, just acknowledging. "Morning," he said calmly. The range officer's confusion deepened, but the senior NCO stiffened, eyes widening, because he recognized that face, that posture, that quiet authority that didn't need introduction. The soldiers on the line watched from a distance, sensing the shift even if they didn't understand it, their earlier arrogance evaporating into raw uncertainty. The general took a slow step forward, then another, stopping just inside the shed. "I was told you retired," he said. The old man's mouth twitched faintly. "I did," he replied, "from talking." The general exhaled, long and controlled, then turned his head slightly, addressing the range officer without breaking eye contact with the old man. "Who authorized the target changes?" The range officer swallowed. "Sir, I didn't," he admitted. The general nodded once. "Good," he said quietly. "Then this is exactly where it's supposed to be." Outside, the soldiers shifted, trying to listen, but only fragments reached them. One whispered, "Why is a general talking to the janitor?" Another shook his head slowly. "That's not a janitor," he muttered, certainty replacing doubt. The general finally turned toward the firing line, eyes sharp. "Stand by," he ordered, voice carrying effortlessly across the range. "No one fires." The command landed heavy. Weapons stayed down. Fingers came off triggers. The range fell silent in a way it never did during drills, and the old man stepped out of the shed, moving slowly toward the line, broom still leaning against the wall behind him like a symbol no one could ignore now. The general walked beside him, not in front, not behind, and the visual alone sent a shock through the soldiers who had mocked him earlier. The old man stopped at the firing line and looked downrange, studying the targets he had changed, the patterns he had set, and then he turned to the soldiers, his gaze steady, not angry, not disappointed, just assessing. "You shoot well when things behave," he said calmly. "You fall apart when they don't." The words hit harder than any shouted correction. The general nodded slowly. "That's why I asked him to observe today," he said, finally answering the unspoken question. The soldiers' stomachs dropped. This hadn't been punishment. It had been a test they didn't know they were taking. The old man looked back at the control shed, then at the soldiers again. "This isn't about scores," he continued. "It's about whether you adapt or panic when the world stops being polite." The general folded his hands behind his back. "Resume the drill," he ordered, "with the targets exactly as they are." The old man stepped aside, returning control to the system without ceremony, and as the range officer prepared to call the line hot again, the soldiers realized the shift was complete. The quiet old man they mocked was no longer invisible, and the firing range was no longer forgiving. The general raised his hand slowly, not to silence gunfire, but to command attention, and the effect was immediate. Every soldier on the firing line straightened, weapons lowered, eyes forward, because authority like that didn't need volume to be obeyed. The range officer stood rigid beside him, face tight with a mix of confusion and dawning respect, while the old man remained just inside the line, hands relaxed at his sides, posture easy, like the pressure in the air wasn't meant for him. The general's voice carried evenly across the range. "This drill was altered intentionally," he said, and a ripple of unease passed through the soldiers. "Not to fail you," he continued, "but to show you what happens when predictability disappears." He paused, letting the words sink in, then turned slightly toward the old man. "This man has spent decades on ranges like this," the general said, "some with better equipment, some with far worse, all of them unforgiving." The soldier's eyes flicked toward the old man, really looking at him now for the first time, and the jokes they'd made felt suddenly childish, embarrassing, and dangerous. One private swallowed hard, remembering how he'd laughed when the targets first shifted. The general took a step back, heels clicking together, posture snapping into ceremonial precision, and then, in a movement so sharp it felt like a crack of thunder without sound, he raised his hand and rendered a full salute, directly to the old man. The range froze. The soldiers stared, disbelief washing over them in waves. A general saluting the man they'd mocked for sweeping brass was something their training manuals had never prepared them for. The old man stiffened, surprise flickering across his face, but instinct overrode discomfort. He returned the salute with exacting form, slower but flawless, a salute honed long before most of the men watching had been born. The general lowered his hand and turned back to the firing line. "You laughed at him," he said calmly, and calm made it worse. "You dismissed him because he was quiet, because his job didn't look impressive." His gaze swept across the soldiers, stopping briefly on the ones who had mocked the loudest. "But when the targets changed, when the routine broke, you didn't look to your instructors, you panicked." He gestured toward the downrange silhouettes. "He didn't." The old man stepped forward half a pace then, finally speaking again. "Combat doesn't brief you," he said quietly. "Targets don't pop when you expect. They don't wait for you to settle." His eyes moved from face to face, not accusing, just honest. "If you can only shoot when the world behaves, you're not ready." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. One soldier's jaw tightened. Another stared at the ground, shame burning hot. The range officer found his voice at last. "Sir," he said to the general, "permission to continue under advanced parameters." General nodded once. "Exactly as set," he replied. "They don't get the easy version anymore." The old man turned back toward the control shed, adjusted one final setting, random delay, unpredictable exposure, mixed distance silhouettes, and then stepped aside, ceding control without ceremony. The range officer took a breath and called the line hot again. This time, when the targets rose, the soldiers reacted differently. There was no laughter, no swagger. Breathing slowed. Movements became deliberate. Misses still happened, but hands didn't flail and frustration didn't turn into panic. The lesson was taking root in real time. After the string ended, the general raised his hand again. "Cease fire!" Weapons were cleared, safeties engaged, and the range settled into a heavy quiet. The general turned back to the old man, voice lower now. "You didn't have to do this," he said. The old man shrugged lightly. "Someone had to," he replied. "They were learning the wrong thing." General nodded, then faced the soldiers one last time. "Today," he said, "you learned why experience doesn't advertise itself, and why mocking what you don't understand can get people killed." He paused. "You will remember this range, not because of your scores, but because the targets didn't warn you, and neither will the enemy." The old man picked up his broom again, the gesture simple and grounding, and as he walked back toward the lanes to clean up the spent brass, no one laughed, no one whispered. Every soldier watched him pass with a new understanding. The man they had mocked had just given them the most honest training they'd ever received. When the final ceasefire echoed across the range and the last targets slid back into their housings, the silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire ever had, settling over the soldiers like a weight they couldn't shrug off. Helmets came off slowly, rifles were grounded with care, and no one spoke until the range officer dismissed the line, his voice quieter now, stripped of routine authority and edged with reflection. The soldiers gathered their gear with a seriousness that hadn't been there that morning, movements deliberate, eyes occasionally drifting toward the old man as he swept brass from the concrete. The same task he'd been doing when they'd laughed, except now every scrape of the broom sounded like punctuation to a lesson they would carry long after the day ended. One by one, the soldiers approached him, not in a crowd, not loudly, but hesitantly, like men stepping toward something they didn't quite deserve. A young private stopped first, swallowing hard. "Sir," he said, the word no longer sarcastic, "I'm sorry, I ran my mouth. I didn't know." The old man looked up, eyes calm, not forgiving out of kindness, but out of understanding. "You didn't need to know who I was," he replied quietly. "You needed to know what you were doing." The private nodded, shame written plainly across his face, and stepped back. Another soldier followed, then another, each apology simpler than the last, stripped of excuses, until the mocking voices from the morning were replaced by something more valuable: accountability. The general watched from a short distance, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing because the best resolutions didn't need speeches. When the last soldier stepped away, the general approached the old man and spoke softly. "They'll remember this," he said. The old man shrugged, sweeping another pile of brass. "They should," he replied. "This range is safer now." The general nodded, then turned toward the formation one final time. "You'll qualify again tomorrow," he announced. "Same targets, same unpredictability." A few soldiers stiffened, but none complained. "And you'll do it without shortcuts," he added, "because what you learned today might save your life later." With that, he dismissed them, and the platoon moved out in disciplined silence, boots crunching gravel, heads lower than before but steadier. As the range cleared, the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning haze, and the old man finished his work, stacking spent casings neatly as if order itself mattered. The range officer approached him, awkward now. "Sir, I didn't realize," he began. The old man held up a hand gently. "You don't need to," he said. "Just don't let routine turn into complacency." The range officer nodded, absorbing it like doctrine. Later, as the old man walked toward the exit with his broom slung over his shoulder, the soldiers lined up for transport paused, and one by one, without command, they snapped to attention, not perfectly, not ceremonially, but sincerely, and held it until he passed. The old man noticed, paused, and gave a small nod in return, nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. He stepped beyond the range fence and into the quiet road beyond, his figure shrinking against the red dirt and scrub, back to being just another old man in worn boots and a faded shirt. But behind him, on that firing range, something permanent had changed. The soldiers no longer laughed at silence. They no longer assumed the easy version was the real one. And every time a target appeared without warning in the weeks that followed, every time a drill went wrong or a plan unraveled, they remembered the morning an old man with a broom taught them that the most dangerous enemy wasn't the unexpected target. It was arrogance, and the refusal to listen before it was too late.